The morning sun hung low over the sleepy downtown streets, spilling pale gold over brick buildings and freshly washed sidewalks. It was just past 7, rush hour for caffeine seekers, and the small cafe on the corner of Maple and 3rd was already alive with the hum of chatter, keyboards, and clinking cups. The cafe prided itself on being community-focused, with its chalkboard slogans about kindness, equality, and local love. Yet, on that particular morning, something deeply hypocritical unfolded behind the cozy facade. A man walked in, a black man, shoulders slightly hunched, wearing a tattered army jacket that once bore the proud insignia of a U.S. infantry division. His boots were worn, the soles nearly separating, and his duffel bag hung heavy at his side. His name was Marcus Reed, a 38-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours overseas before life, like it so often does, turned cruel. After returning home, Marcus found himself struggling with PTSD, job rejections, and the collapse of the small family he'd once fought to protect. By the time he entered that cafe, he had been homeless for nearly a year. Marcus had a soft voice and gentle manners. He didn't beg, he simply carried hope in his eyes, the kind that spoke of endurance, not desperation. On that morning, he had managed to gather a few coins and a crumpled dollar bill, just enough for a small black coffee. It wasn't much, but it meant warmth, dignity, and a reminder that he still belonged somewhere in this fast, moving world. Behind the counter stood Ethan, the store manager, a young man in his late 20s, dressed neatly, always wearing the practiced smile that came out when customers looked like they belonged. Ethan had grown up in the suburbs, gone to business school, and viewed people like Marcus as part of a problem, to be avoided rather than understood. To him, the cafe's motto of inclusivity was just marketing, not morality. As Marcus stepped up to the counter, the usual murmur of the cafe seemed to shift. Conversation slowed, glances darted toward the man with the worn jacket. Ethan's eyes hardened almost instantly. The warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by cold, bureaucratic efficiency. He scanned Marcus up and down, noting the frayed sleeves and dirt under the fingernails, a silent judgment that outweighed any words. When Marcus placed his few coins on the counter, Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but ensuring others nearby could hear. His tone carried disdain disguised as policy. He claimed the cafe had a cleanliness rule, that they couldn't serve someone in his condition. Marcus's hand trembled as he tried to explain that he could pay, that he just wanted a cup of coffee like anyone else. But Ethan cut him off, his lips curling into a smirk of superiority. Around them, no one stepped in. The regulars, students, professionals, mothers with strollers, pretended not to notice. Some looked away in guilt, others watched with quiet agreement, comforted by the invisible line between them and us. Marcus's coins were pushed back across the counter. Ethan turned to the next customer as if dismissing a nuisance. Humiliation burned through Marcus's chest. The heat of shame rose to his face as he gathered his things. He wanted to speak, to remind Ethan that he had fought for people like him to live free and safe, but his words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded silently and walked out, the tiny bell above the cafe door chiming like a cruel echo. Outside, the wind bit at his cheeks. The city moved on without noticing him. Cars honking, people laughing. The smell of roasted beans wafting from behind the window that had just shut him out. Marcus sat on the curb across the street, head bowed, his breath fogging in the cold air. It wasn't just coffee he had been denied, it was dignity, belonging, humanity. Inside, Ethan carried on as if nothing had happened. He told the barista to sanitize the counter, where Marcus had stood, muttering something about keeping up appearances. He didn't notice the woman sitting in the corner by the window, the one who had filmed the entire encounter on her phone. Her face was pale with disbelief, her fingers trembling slightly as she reviewed the footage. The cafe's slogan, "Kindness brewed fresh daily," glowed ironically on the wall behind Ethan as he served another customer, laughing. That woman's name was Rachel. She was a journalist, in town working on a story about veterans and homelessness. What she had just witnessed turned her stomach. The hypocrisy was too sharp, too painful to ignore. She looked down at her phone again at Marcus's face, tired, humble, undeserving of what had just happened. And she made a decision. Outside, Marcus stood, hoisting his bag over his shoulder. He began to walk slowly down the block, past people who didn't see him, toward nowhere in particular. He didn't know that the moment he walked away, the world had already started to turn. His story, captured in a shaky, 3-minute video, was about to reach millions. By nightfall, the video would explode across social media. The cafe's name would be on every platform, tagged with outrage, disbelief, and calls for accountability. Ethan would become the face of Prejudice, his smug smirk frozen in the frame as he turned away from a veteran who had only wanted a cup of coffee. But for now, Marcus didn't know any of that. All he knew was the weight of rejection, the cold creeping into his bones, and the question that haunted him every day: how could a country that he had served so loyally turn its back on him so completely? He found a bench under a flickering streetlight and sat down, the hum of the city fading to a low, distant roar. His stomach growled, his hands trembled, and his eyes began to close from exhaustion. Somewhere behind him, that little cafe still glowed warm and full, its customers sipping coffee in comfort. And somewhere on a phone screen, his story had just begun to burn. As the night deepened and the city lights blurred, Marcus drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that the storm of karma was already gathering. And this time, it wasn't going to miss its mark. By morning, the world had changed, though Marcus didn't know it yet. The cold dawn crept over the city, washing the streets in gray light, and the usual hum of life resumed. Commuters filled sidewalks, buses hissed at every corner, and coffee cups once again traded hands. But online, something was different. On screens across the country, a 3-minute video was spreading like wildfire. It began innocently, a short clip on a small social platform, posted by Rachel, the journalist who had witnessed everything. The caption was simple but piercing. He refused to serve a homeless black veteran. Watch how we treat the people who served us. The video began with Marcus placing his coins on the counter and ended with him walking out, silent and defeated, while Ethan smirked behind the register. Within hours, outrage poured in. Thousands of comments demanded justice. Veterans groups shared it, civil rights pages reposted it, and hashtags calling for boycotts began trending. By mid-morning, the café's phone lines were jammed, their website crashed, and their social media pages were flooded with furious messages. Ethan's face was everywhere. His name, his job title, his dismissive expression, captured forever in pixels, became a symbol of everything wrong with performative kindness. People dissected every second of the footage. The disdain in his eyes, the tone of his voice, the silent complicity of the customers who had watched and done nothing. Commentators debated what it said about modern America, how empathy could be marketed but not practiced. Ethan arrived at work unaware of the storm. His phone had been buzzing since dawn, but he ignored it, assuming it was the usual messages from friends. As he stepped into the cafe, he noticed the uneasy silence. The baristas avoided his gaze. The manager's office door stood open, the owner waiting inside with a face pale as paper. The television behind the counter played the morning news. And there it was, his own image on the screen. The reporter's voice cut through the static. Outrage is growing after a local cafe manager was filmed refusing service to a homeless black veteran. The words hit him like a physical blow. His knees nearly gave out. The clip played in slow motion. Every second of cruelty replayed in a loop, inescapable and undeniable. The owner didn't even need to speak. Ethan's job was gone before noon. His face, once hidden behind corporate politeness, was now public property, memes, hashtags, news coverage. People tracked down his old posts, his photos, his college history. Anonymous voices filled his inbox with hate. He had become the villain in a viral morality play, and there was no curtain to hide behind. Meanwhile, Marcus woke under the same bench where he had slept, unaware of the chaos unfolding. He gathered his things and began another day the same way he had for months, quietly, humbly, searching for work, warmth, or a simple kindness. But as he walked past a convenience store window, something strange caught his eye, his own face on a small TV inside. He stepped closer, disbelief clouding his thoughts. The reporter spoke his name, Marcus Reed, a decorated veteran of 2 tours overseas. For the first time in years, the world was saying his name not as a statistic, not as a forgotten man, but as a person. The interview clip showed a photo from his service days, smiling in uniform, medals glinting in the desert sun, his throat tightened. It was like seeing another version of himself, a man he once believed still existed. Rachel's video had ignited something larger than she expected. News outlets wanted interviews. Local politicians issued statements condemning discrimination. Veterans' charities offered to help Marcus find housing. Donations started flooding in, small amounts from strangers who said they were sorry that they saw him now. Marcus was overwhelmed. For years he had been invisible. Now, suddenly, the entire nation was looking at him. But attention, he soon realized, was a fragile thing. It burned bright, then faded. What mattered wasn't pity, it was what came next. By evening, reporters had found him at a public shelter. Cameras surrounded him as he tried to explain that he didn't want fame, just fairness. He spoke softly, his words steady but full of pain. He said he didn't hate Ethan. He pitied him for the blindness that prejudice creates. He only wanted others to remember the next time they looked away from someone who had lost everything. Back at the café, the building that had once bustled with customers now sat nearly empty. The windows, once glowing with morning light, were dark. Protest signs appeared on the sidewalk: "Serve humanity, not hypocrisy." The café's name had become a national symbol of shame. Ethan sat alone in his apartment that night, scrolling through the wreckage of his own reputation. He had tried deleting his accounts, but screenshots lived forever. Old friends avoided his messages. Even his parents refused to pick up the phone. He told himself he wasn't racist, that it was just a policy, that he was just doing his job. But the truth clawed at him. The video didn't lie. The look in Marcus's eyes when he pushed those coins back, it haunted him. He couldn't unsee it. Meanwhile, Marcus's world began to shift. The same city that had turned its back on him now opened small doors. A veterans organization arranged temporary housing. A local restaurant offered him work as a dishwasher. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it gave him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Still, not everyone celebrated him. Some people whispered that he was just lucky the video went viral, that others deserved help more. He ignored them. He wasn't chasing fame, he just wanted to rebuild. But fate wasn't finished with either man. The same city that tore Ethan down and lifted Marcus up was about to cross their paths once more, under circumstances neither could have imagined. One cold evening, weeks after the video's peak, Ethan found himself wandering aimlessly through downtown. His savings were dwindling, job applications unanswered. His name a stain employers refused to touch. The cafe chain had issued a public apology, but privately, they'd made sure to distance themselves from him completely. As the wind picked up and streetlights flickered, Ethan ducked into a nearby shelter to get warm. Inside, volunteers were serving soup to a line of weary faces. Among them stood a man he recognized instantly, the same veteran whose coins he had once pushed away, Marcus Reed. Their eyes met across the room. And in that silent, frozen moment, karma finally came knocking. The shelter was warm, but the air inside felt thick with unspoken stories, of loss, of struggle, of humanity hanging by a thread. Ethan stood near the entrance, hesitant, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as if to hide his shame. The room smelled of stew and worn clothes, a mix of comfort and hardship. Volunteers moved through the crowd, ladling soup into paper bowls, offering smiles that carried no judgment. And there, near the back of the line, was Marcus. His posture was straighter than it had been weeks ago. The shadows under his eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet steadiness. He wore a clean shirt donated by the shelter, and though the jacket was still the same old army green, it now seemed to fit like armor rather than burden. Ethan froze. He wanted to turn around and leave, to escape the suffocating guilt pressing on his chest, but something in Marcus's presence, calm, grounded, undeservedly forgiving, kept him rooted in place. The last time he'd seen that man, Ethan had been on top of the world, manager, confident, sure of himself. Now the roles had reversed. He was the one looking for mercy, and he didn't even deserve to ask for it. Marcus hadn't noticed him yet. He moved through the line quietly, helping others carry trays when their hands trembled, offering a hand to the elderly, a nod of encouragement to those who avoided eye contact. He had no idea that the man who'd humiliated him weeks earlier was standing just a few feet away, hollow-eyed and desperate. Ethan's mind raced. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to say something, anything, but shame silenced him. Every memory of that morning at the café replayed in cruel detail: the push of the coins, the smirk, the customer's silence. Back then, he'd convinced himself he was maintaining standards. Now, he saw it for what it really was: a moment of cowardice, fueled by arrogance and ignorance. When a volunteer approached with a clipboard and asked if he needed a meal, Ethan nodded numbly. He hadn't eaten all day. He was just another man now, anonymous. He stripped of privilege and position. He sat at a table near the corner, his bowl steaming in front of him, the smell of lentils and salt filling his lungs. He looked up and found Marcus staring back at him. Their eyes met. No words, no movement, just silence thick enough to drown in. Recognition flickered across Marcus's face, not of anger but of painful understanding. Ethan lowered his gaze, unable to bear the weight of it. Marcus walked over, slow and deliberate. The people around them continued eating, laughing quietly, unaware of the gravity unfolding in that corner of the room. When Marcus reached the table, he didn't say anything. He simply pulled out the chair opposite Ethan and sat down. For a long while, neither moved. Ethan could feel his heart pounding. Every instinct told him to flee, but guilt held him still. Marcus broke the silence, not with words, but with action. He slid his piece of bread across the table toward Ethan. It was a small gesture, simple and human. Ethan looked up, eyes glistening. Marcus wasn't offering pity. He was offering a chance to acknowledge, to change, to start over. It was then that Ethan realized what karma truly was. It wasn't punishment for its own sake, it was reflection. It held up a mirror and forced you to see yourself. The humiliation, the loss, the fear he now felt. These were the same feelings Marcus had carried that morning at the café. The universe hadn't ruined him out of cruelty. It had given him the chance to understand. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stayed at the shelter, listening to the murmurs of men and women around him, the quiet sobs, the soft prayers. Each voice was a reminder that every person there had a story, each as complicated and worthy as his own. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel above anyone. He felt equal. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the grimy windows, Ethan found Marcus outside, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. It was the same kind of coffee Marcus had been denied weeks ago, dark, simple, warming. Ethan hesitated, then walked over. Marcus turned, his expression unreadable. Ethan wanted to apologize, but his voice cracked. The words tumbled out in fragments. Sorry, ashamed, wrong. Marcus listened quietly. When Ethan finished, the silence lingered, heavy but cleansing. Marcus nodded slowly, not with approval, but with understanding. He told Ethan softly, gently, that forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It wasn't earned with apologies, it was proven through change. That day marked the beginning of an unlikely connection. Ethan began volunteering at the shelter, serving food, cleaning tables, learning names. No one there cared about his past or his downfall. They cared only that he showed up and did the work. He and Marcus didn't talk much at first. Their conversations were brief, practical. But over time, the tension eased. They shared quiet moments, sorting donations, repairing shelves, watching the sunset from the steps outside. Ethan learned about Marcus's time overseas, the friends he lost, the battles he fought both in war and at home. He learned what it meant to serve something greater than yourself, and Marcus saw something shift in Ethan too. The arrogance was gone. In its place was humility, a man stripped bare of pretense, finally learning what empathy truly meant. But life, as always, had more lessons to give. One evening, months later, the shelter faced closure. Funding had been cut, and eviction notices were piling up. Dozens of men and women, people with nowhere else to go, were at risk of being turned back onto the streets. Marcus and Ethan sat together in silence, both knowing what that would mean. Ethan's eyes burned with determination. He couldn't let it happen. Not again. Not to these people. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and said he had an idea. Marcus watched him go, unsure what plan Ethan could possibly have. But something in his stride, steady, unshaken, felt different this time. Ethan was about to confront the very world that had once applauded his cruelty. He was going to use it to make things right. Ethan hadn't felt that kind of purpose in years. Not when he managed the café, not when he chased numbers and performance metrics, and certainly not when he'd believed himself better than others. Now, standing in the cold night air with the city lights stretching before him, he felt something different: urgency, conviction, and the quiet ache of a conscience finally awake. He walked fast, hands stuffed in his pockets, mind racing. The shelter couldn't close. Not after what he'd seen. The faces, the small victories, the fragile humanity that bloomed there despite the world's indifference. He thought of Marcus, the quiet strength that man carried, the dignity that refused to die. Ethan knew this wasn't just about saving a building. It was about redemption, for the shelter, for Marcus, and maybe even for himself. By morning, he was outside the same cafe where his downfall had begun. The sign had changed, the cheerful chalkboard slogans were gone. The company had rebranded after the scandal, reopening under a new name and new management. But the building was the same, the polished windows still reflecting the street like an unblinking eye. Ethan pushed the door open. Heads turned. Some people recognized him immediately. Others just sensed the tension in the air. The new manager, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up from the counter. Ethan approached, explaining who he was and why he was there. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he spoke. He didn't hide what he had done. He laid it bare, the discrimination, the humiliation, the fall, and what he'd learned since. He asked for help. Not for himself, but for the shelter. He told them how close it was to shutting down, how many people it served, how much it meant to the cities forgotten. He knew it was a long shot. After all, he was the reason their brand had once been dragged through the mud. But that was exactly why he came, because maybe in the shadow of that failure something good could grow. The manager listened quietly. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, to his surprise, she agreed to hear more. The café's corporate headquarters had been desperate to repair their image since the viral scandal. A community outreach campaign might be exactly what they needed. Ethan left with a promise of a meeting with the company's regional director. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. Back at the shelter, Marcus watched him return with a spark in his eye that hadn't been there in months. Ethan explained the plan, the potential partnership, and the opportunity to turn their story into something larger, a message about rebuilding, forgiveness, and true community service. Marcus listened carefully. He didn't say much, but he nodded slowly. He understood the weight of what Ethan was trying to do. Redemption, he knew, wasn't a word, it was a journey. The next week was a blur. Ethan and Marcus worked side by side, preparing for the meeting. They gathered testimonies from shelter residents, photographs, and data showing the shelter's impact. Ethan stayed up late, drafting proposals on borrowed computers, his mind consumed with details. Budgets, marketing angles, sustainability plans. For the first time, Marcus saw Ethan's drive as something good. He watched the former manager channel his energy not into self-advancement, but into purpose. When the day of the meeting arrived, they stood together in a glass-walled conference room high above the city. Across from them sat executives in tailored suits, people who had never known hunger, who viewed charity as a public relations investment rather than a moral duty. Ethan spoke first. He didn't use buzzwords or marketing jargon. He spoke like a man who had learned his lessons the hard way. He told them about Marcus, his service, his resilience, the day at the café that changed both their lives. He spoke about empathy, responsibility, and what it means to act on the values a company claims to hold. The room was silent when he finished. The executives exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Marcus stepped forward then, his voice calm but commanding. He didn't ask for pity, he asked for partnership. He told them that real change wasn't about slogans on a chalkboard, it was about showing up for people who had been forgotten. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. Whether out of genuine conviction or calculated image management, the company agreed to sponsor the shelter. They pledged funds for renovation, job training programs, and food services. The partnership was announced publicly a week later, accompanied by a statement about growth through accountability. When the news broke, the internet exploded again. But this time, the tone was different. Articles titled, "The Barista Who Changed His Life" and "From Scandal to Service, a Lesson in Redemption" spread across feeds. The same social media users who had once condemned Ethan now shared cautious words of respect. But Ethan didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the shelter's new kitchen being built, the rows of new beds replacing broken ones, the fresh paint covering years of decay. He cared about the smiles of the people who no longer had to sleep on cold pavement. Marcus watched him from the doorway one evening as Ethan helped unload supplies. The once arrogant manager was now kneeling on the floor, hammering nails, sleeves rolled up, sweat running down his brow. Marcus felt something unexpected, pride. But even as the shelter's future brightened, a shadow lingered. One night, Marcus received a call from a veterans clinic. A doctor who'd seen the viral video recognized him and reviewed his old medical records. The results were troubling, an untreated condition from his time overseas, something that had gone unnoticed for years. He was advised to come in immediately. Marcus didn't tell Ethan right away. He didn't want to overshadow the progress they'd made. But as days passed, the fatigue grew worse. The headaches, the dizziness, the moments when his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ethan noticed. He asked what was wrong, but Marcus brushed it off, insisting it was just stress. Then, one morning, while helping serve breakfast at the shelter, Marcus collapsed. The tray slipped from his hands, the room erupting into chaos as volunteers rushed to his side. Ethan froze for half a second before instinct took over. He knelt beside Marcus, calling his name, his heart pounding as paramedics were summoned. As they lifted Marcus onto a stretcher, Ethan held his hand, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The man who had once been invisible was now at the center of a story that had changed lives. And now that story teetered on the edge of tragedy. The ambulance doors closed, sirens cutting through the morning air. Ethan stood alone in the street, trembling, not from guilt this time, but from fear. The shelter felt hollow without Marcus. His absence echoed through the halls like a missing heartbeat. The man who had once been the quiet center of hope was now lying in a hospital bed somewhere, fighting a battle unseen. Ethan visited every day. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, the kind of place where time moved differently, slower, heavier. Marcus was in the veterans' ward, surrounded by men with stories etched into their skin. Machines beeped softly beside his bed, a steady rhythm marking the fragile line between stability and decline. Doctors explained that his collapse had been caused by a combination of exhaustion and a long-ignored neurological condition, a fragment of shrapnel from his service years that had gone undetected. Surgery was risky, but without it, the complications would worsen. Marcus listened to their words with quiet resignation. He had faced worse before, but something inside him told him this time would be different. Ethan sat beside him whenever he could, guilt and gratitude mixing in equal measure. He remembered every cruel moment from that morning at the café. The disdain, the rejection, the arrogance. He thought about how easily he could have let Marcus fade into another nameless tragedy. Instead, Marcus had given him something priceless, the chance to change. But that chance now hung by a thread. News of Marcus's condition spread quickly. The same online community that had once rallied behind him now returned, flooding the shelter's page with messages of support and sorrow. Donations poured in again, this time not for outrage, but for compassion. Help Marcus heal. Campaign started overnight, raising funds for his treatment. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Money couldn't buy redemption, and it couldn't erase years of neglect from a system that had failed men like Marcus over and over again. At night, Ethan returned to the shelter and worked tirelessly. He organized food drives, coordinated volunteers, and made sure every resident had a bed and a meal. He wanted to keep the place running in Marcus's absence, to honor him through action, but exhaustion gnawed at him. He barely slept, surviving on coffee and willpower. He started keeping a small notebook, a habit he picked up from Marcus. In it, he wrote what he'd learned about dignity, forgiveness, and how easy it was to forget someone's humanity until it was too late. Weeks passed. Marcus underwent surgery. It was long, complicated, and uncertain. Ethan waited in the hospital lobby, fingers clenched, head bowed. When the surgeon finally emerged, his expression gave nothing away. The operation had been successful, but recovery would be slow, maybe lifelong. Marcus had survived, but just barely. When Ethan was finally allowed to see him, Marcus looked fragile yet peaceful. Tubes and wires surrounded him, but his eyes still held that same quiet strength. Ethan sat in silence, watching him breathe. He realized then that redemption wasn't about undoing the past. It was about showing up again and again, even when it hurt. As weeks turned into months, Marcus began to heal. His speech returned slowly, his hands trembled but grew steadier with therapy. He joked softly with the nurses, his spirit unbroken. Ethan was there for every milestone, every faltering step, every wary smile. One afternoon, Marcus motioned for a piece of paper. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were clear. He told Ethan not to waste his second chance chasing guilt. Use it, he wrote. Turn it into something that lasts. Those words became Ethan's compass. When Marcus was finally discharged, the shelter held a celebration. Residents, volunteers, and even reporters gathered to welcome him back. The kitchen buzzed with laughter and the smell of home, cooked food. Ethan gave a short speech, not about himself, but about Marcus, about the people who live unseen among us, and about how one act of cruelty had sparked a movement of compassion. But Marcus wasn't the type to bask in praise. He stood quietly at the back, smiling faintly, leaning on his cane. The applause didn't matter. What mattered was that lives had changed. Not just his or Ethan's, but countless others. Still, both men knew the fight wasn't over. The shelter, though stable for now, depended on continued funding and goodwill. Prejudice and ignorance hadn't disappeared. They just wore subtler faces. Marcus often reminded Ethan of that. "It's not about one bad man," he said softly one evening. "It's about the world that lets him exist." Ethan understood. And so, together, they decided to do more. They began speaking publicly, at schools, at community centers, at veterans' organizations. Their story, raw and unembellished, touched people deeply. Ethan spoke of privilege, blindness, and accountability. Marcus spoke of resilience, forgiveness, and the unseen battles people fight every day. Their message wasn't polished, but it was real, and it resonated. Soon, a local news outlet picked up their story again. This time, the headline read, "From Prejudice to Purpose: The Two Men Who Changed Each Other." The video reached millions once more, but now it wasn't fueled by outrage. It was fueled by hope. As months passed, their friendship deepened into something unbreakable. They became symbols not of tragedy, but of transformation. Yet even hope carries a shadow. Marcus's health remained fragile. He never fully regained the strength he once had. Some nights, when the pain returned, Ethan could see the wariness behind his calm eyes, the quiet fear that his time might be running out. But Marcus never let it show for long. "If I go," he'd say softly, "at least I'll go knowing I wasn't invisible anymore." Ethan would sit beside him, silent, feeling the weight of that truth. Then one cold morning, as dawn painted the city in pale gold, the same kind of morning that had once changed both their lives, Ethan received a call from the hospital. Marcus had been admitted again during the night. This time it was different. The call came just after sunrise. Ethan's hands trembled as he fumbled for his keys, rushing through the empty streets toward the hospital. The city was quiet, eerily so. The same streets that had once ignored Marcus Reed now seemed to mourn him in silence. When Ethan arrived, the nurse at the front desk met his eyes with that practiced sympathy, the kind that said everything without a word. Marcus was in the ICU, unconscious. Complications had returned, sudden and severe. His body, already worn by years of struggle, was losing the fight. Ethan sat beside him for hours. Machines hummed softly, each beep echoing like a heartbeat refusing to surrender. The room smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of the world outside. A coffee cup someone had left behind, the scent of rain through an open window. He looked at Marcus's face, peaceful, almost serene, and felt a weight pressing against his chest. This man had every reason to hate him, and yet he had offered him grace. Marcus had taught him that dignity could survive even in the darkest corners, that forgiveness wasn't weakness, but strength beyond measure. Ethan thought of that morning at the cafe years ago, the arrogance, the indifference, the way he'd looked through Marcus instead of at him. If he could go back, he would give anything to change it. But life doesn't offer rewinds. It offers consequences and, if you're lucky, redemption. He reached out, taking Marcus's hand in his own. The skin was cold but steady. He whispered a promise, a quiet vow that Marcus's legacy wouldn't fade, that the world would remember not the humiliation, but the humanity. Hours passed. Doctors came and went, their words technical and grim. At some point, the line between hope and acceptance began to blur, and when the last monitor tone turned into a flat, continuous hum, Ethan didn't cry. He just sat there, holding on, his heart heavy but full. Marcus Reed, the man the world once ignored, was gone. But his story was far from over. The days that followed blurred together in grief and movement. News spread quickly. The shelter held a memorial service. Nothing grand, just candles, photographs, and voices sharing memories. People who had once been strangers came forward, telling stories of how Marcus had changed their lives. Veterans who had watched his video years ago attended in uniform, saluting him one last time. Ethan spoke last. His voice shook as he stood before the crowd, holding Marcus's worn army jacket in his hands. He spoke not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one who had been transformed by another's grace. He told them about the lessons Marcus left behind, about compassion, humility, and how one simple act of kindness can ripple outward, reshaping lives far beyond what anyone can see. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, the people stood, one by one, applauding not in celebration but in reverence. After the service, Ethan stayed behind, sitting in the empty hall. The flickering candlelight danced across the jacket on the chair beside him. He traced the faded patch on the shoulder, proof of a life that had endured both war and indifference. He realized then that Marcus's greatest victory wasn't the attention, or the donations, or even the redemption it sparked. It was that he had made people see. For years, Marcus had walked invisible through the same streets that now spoke his name. He had turned his pain into purpose, and in doing so reminded the world that humanity isn't found in grand gestures. It's found in the quiet choice to care. Months passed. The shelter was renamed Reed House, a permanent tribute to the man who had embodied its mission. A plaque near the entrance bore his words, "Kindness isn't charity, it's duty." Under Ethan's direction, Reed House expanded into a network of outreach centers, places where veterans, the homeless, and the forgotten could find not pity, but belonging. Each new opening carried Marcus's story, told not as a tragedy, but as proof of what empathy could do. Ethan never sought credit. He worked quietly, dedicating every project, every meal served, to the man who had saved his soul. Years later, during a televised interview about the shelter's growth, a reporter asked Ethan the question everyone wanted to hear, "What changed you?" He paused, eyes drifting toward a framed photograph on the wall behind him. Marcus, smiling faintly in his uniform. Ethan answered softly, "Cup of coffee." The reporter looked puzzled, waiting for him to elaborate. Ethan didn't. He didn't need to. The world already knew the rest. As the cameras shut off and the lights dimmed, Ethan walked outside. The city buzzed around him. Cars honking, people rushing, life moving on. He passed by a café on the corner, where a young barista smiled warmly at a man in ragged clothes, handing him a hot drink without hesitation. Ethan stopped and watched, his throat tightening. The world had changed. Not entirely, but enough. He turned and walked toward Reed House, the evening sun painting the streets gold, just like the morning that had started it all. Inside the shelter, laughter and conversation filled the air. The walls were lined with murals, veterans' families, and one large portrait of Marcus at the center, his eyes full of quiet strength. Beneath it were words etched into the paint. He refused to serve the homeless black veteran, until karma walked in. But what karma really brought was a second chance. Ethan smiled faintly, setting down his bag. Marcus Reed was gone, but his legacy lived on. In every meal served, every hand extended, every act of kindness that now rippled through a city once blind to men like him. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt peace. The story that began with rejection ended not in vengeance, but in grace. Karma, he realized, wasn't cruel. It was just honest. It had broken him to build something greater. And somewhere, in the quiet beyond, Marcus was smiling. The end.